Good afternoon. Bonjour. My name is Karen Hogan. I became the Auditor General of Canada last June. The 5 performance audits that I am presenting today would have been released in 2020 had it not been for the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our work and on the entities we audit. Les rapports livrés aujourd'hui incluent une copie de notre examen spécial de la Fondation canadienne des relations raciales, qui a été rendu public en décembre dernier. Tous ces documents seront déposés à la Chambre des communes plus tard aujourd'hui. Je vais vous parler en premier de notre audit sur l'approvisionnement des solutions de technologie de l'information complexe. Many of the government's IT systems are aging and need to be replaced to better serve Canadians. They include systems that deliver benefits like employment insurance, old age security and pensions, systems that are used to pay government employees, and systems that support government telecommunications infrastructure. Overall, we found that the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, Public Services and Procurement Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, and Shared Services Canada made good progress in modernizing their procurement approaches. Par exemple, pour 2 des 3 processus d'approvisionnement que nous avons examinés, les organisations avaient mis en place de nouvelles pratiques d'approvisionnement agile, y compris de diviser des méga-projets en éléments plus petits et de consulter fréquemment et dès le début des processus les utilisateurs finaux et les fournisseurs afin de cerner les besoins et d'élaborer des solutions. Nous avons aussi relevé des améliorations possibles dans certains secteurs, comme les directives et la formation donnée aux agents d'approvisionnement et des meilleurs mécanismes pour surveiller l'équité, l'ouverture et la transparence. I am encouraged by the openness to explore new ways of doing business that we noted in this audit. To pave the way for further progress, these organizations will need to build on what they've learned so far, to continue modernizing their procurement approaches and maximize services and support for Canadians. Let's now turn to our audit of the National Shipbuilding Strategy. This audit provided an opportunity to examine a complex program in its early stages, once the procurement process was completed. Overall, we found that during our audit period, the National Shipbuilding Strategy was slow to deliver the combat and non-combat ships that Canada needs to meet its domestic and international obligations for science and defense. La livraison d'un grand nombre de navires a accusé des retards importants. Si d'autres retards devaient survenir, plusieurs navires pourraient être retirés avant que les navires de remplacement ne soient opérationnels. La Défense nationale, Pêche et Océan Canada, Services publics et approvisionnement Canada, ainsi qu'Innovation, Sciences et Développement économique Canada, ont réagi aux circonstances qui ralentissaient la livraison des navires. Ils ont pris des décisions importantes pendant notre audit pour augmenter les chances que les livraisons à venir aient lieu en temps opportun. That said, I am still concerned that the strategy was slow to deliver. Considering the unknown impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on work in departments and shipyards, and with the bulk of new ships yet to be built, departments need to look for opportunities to further improve how they manage risks and contingencies. I am now going to turn to a couple of audits that more closely impact the day-to-day life of Canadians. The first examined the Canada Child Benefit Program. This income-based benefit program is important to help families who need financial support raise their children. The audit also reviewed the one-time additional payment of up to $300 per child issued in May 2020 to help eligible families during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dans l'ensemble, nous avons constaté que l'Agence du revenu du Canada avait géré le programme de l'allocation canadienne pour enfants de manière à verser en temps utile des prestations exactes à des milliers de familles admissibles. Nous avons relevé des secteurs où l'Agence pouvait améliorer l'administration du programme. Par exemple, un mécanisme amélioré d'échange de renseignements entre d'autres organisations qui aviserait l'Agence lorsque les bénéficiaires quittent le Canada en permanence, lui permettrait d'éviter de verser des prestations basées sur des renseignements périmés. Turning to another people's story, we audited Indigenous Services Canada's support to ensure that First Nations communities have reliable access to safe drinking water. Despite committing to do so by March 2021, Indigenous Services Canada did not meet the government's commitment to remove all long-term drinking water advisories for public systems in First Nations communities. Drinking water advisories have remained a constant in many communities, with almost half outstanding for more than 10 years. In some cases, advisories were lifted as a result of interim measures that did not fully address underlying deficiencies. Les efforts du ministère ont été limités par divers enjeux, y compris une politique et une formule de financement désuétée pour assurer le fonctionnement et l'entretien des réseaux publics d'alimentation en eau. De plus, le ministère s'emploie à reviser le cadre législatif pour fournir aux collectivités des Premières Nations des protections en ce qui a trait à l'eau potable comparables à celles offertes aux autres collectivités du Canada. I am very concerned and honestly disheartened that this long-standing issue is still not resolved. Access to safe drinking water is a basic human necessity. I don't believe anyone would say that this is in any way an acceptable situation in Canada in 2021. Indigenous Services Canada must work in partnership with First Nations to develop and implement a lasting solution for safe drinking water in First Nations communities. Je vais passer maintenant au dernier audit que nous présentons aujourd'hui. Il fait suite à certaines recommandations découlant de notre audit de 2013 sur la surveillance de la sécurité des chemins de fer exercée par Transport Canada. Nous avons constaté que Transport Canada n'avait toujours pas entièrement donné suite aux recommandations que nous avions faites en 2013. L'audit a démontré que le ministère avait apporté des améliorations importantes à la planification et à la priorisation de ses activités pour surveiller la sécurité du transport du rail et pour assurer le suivi des plans et des mesures établies par des compagnies de chemin de fer pour corriger les lacunes décelées. Toutefois, il n'était pas en mesure de montrer si ces mesures avaient contribué à améliorer la sécurité du rail dans son ensemble. Quand on consacre des gens et du temps à régler des problèmes, on devrait être en mesure d'évaluer si l'investissement porte fruit. Rail safety accidents can have serious consequences, causing devastating loss of life and environmental damage. I am very concerned that while Transport Canada has taken some action to address our recommendations, 8 years after our last audit, there is still much left to do to improve oversight of rail safety in Canada. All of these audits touch on areas that have direct and indirect ramifications for Canadians across the country. Whether it's reliable access to safe drinking water or ensuring the safe movement of people and goods on our national railway systems. There are some serious and long-standing issues here. They need to be resolved permanently and soon. Thank you. I'm now ready to answer your questions.
We'll now go to question period. Nous allons passer à la période de questions. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Please identify yourself. Comme la formule habituelle, une question et une question de suivi. On vous demande, s'il vous plaît, de vous nommer avant de poser votre question. We'll go first to the phone and then to the floor. Operator, could we have a first question from the phone, please?
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Si vous désirez poser une question, veuillez s'il vous plaît appuyer sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. You may cancel your question at any time by pressing star 2. Vous pouvez à tout moment annuler votre question en appuyant sur les touches étoile 2. The first question is from, la première question est de Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Please go ahead, à vous la parole.
Bonjour, Madame la Vérificatrice générale. Merci de prendre nos questions. J'aimerais commencer avec une question concernant le rapport numéro 3 sur l'accès à l'eau potable salubre dans les collectivités. J'aimerais vous entendre à propos de la formule de financement qui est désuète et de savoir s'il y a un lien entre le fait que les salaires sont inférieurs pour les opérateurs à leurs homologues ailleurs au pays.
Alors, merci pour la question. Ce que nous avons constaté dans notre audit, c'est qu'en effet, la formule de financement avait dû à une mise à jour. Ça fait presque une trentaine d'années que la formule n'a pas été revisitée. Elle ne répond pas en ce moment aux besoins des Premières Nations. Et en effet, comme vous avez mentionné, un des aspects, c'est les salaires pour les opérateurs des systèmes d'eau. La rétention, elle est très difficile puisque les opérateurs d'eau sont payés environ 30% moins que leurs collègues dans d'autres régions du pays.
D'accord. Donc, il y a un lien entre la formule, si je comprends bien, de financement et ce manque d'opérateurs-là. Laissez-moi vous emmener concernant la sécurité ferroviaire. J'essaie de comprendre de quelle façon est-ce que le fait qu'on n'ait pas le résultat de données d'inspection, par exemple, de quelle façon est-ce que ça met véritablement la sécurité des Canadiens en jeu?
Alors, dans notre rapport sur la sécurité du rail, nous avons vérifié, c'est un suivi de notre rapport de 2013, et nous avons vérifié si Transport Canada a en effet pris action sur les recommandations. Nous avons vu qu'ils ont augmenté la quantité d'inspections et un meilleur suivi sur les processus ou les mesures correctives. Nous avons vu une augmentation dans les audits des systèmes de sécurité dans les compagnies de chemin de fer. Mais en effet, Transport Canada ne mesure pas si toute cette activité a vraiment amélioré la sécurité sur les chemins de fer. Et c'est là la grosse lacune que nous avons soulevée et fait une recommandation. Si on va investir du temps et de l'énergie, on devrait être en mesure de savoir si l'activité améliore vraiment la sécurité.
Operator, next question, please. I gather there are no more questions from the phone. We'll then go to the floor.
Ms. Hogan, Tom Korski, Blacklocks, what corrective action, if any, did you take on learning of your office's complicated relationship with a Liberal lobbyist at Blue Sky Strategy?
So throughout all of our work at the office, we often contract out expert advice. We do that for many different aspects, and we try to have varied points of views in order to make sure that we are covering all of the perspectives across the entire country. So we make sure that the contracts that we procure follow the procurement rules set by the government.
You haven't answered my question, but my follow-up is thus. You were just written up by the procurement ombudsman. Your office contracting manager actually wrote a guide on how to skirt the rules that require public tendering. You breached the Access of Information Act in withholding the records. We had to complain to the OIC. You're the accountability police. That's what the Auditor General is. So at no point in this process, as you awarded a sole-sourced contract to Susan Smith, a Liberal lobbyist, fed her advance copies of your audits months before they were tabled in Parliament, and breached procurement rules, did anyone feel at least ironic, Ms. Hogan?
So I have taken a look at the contracts, and we followed the contracting rules set out by the government. As I said, in preparation for tabling day, we seek advice and views from so many people across the country. And we want to make sure that we have covered all Canadians when we sit down and talk about our work.
Thank you. Do we have questions on the phone, please?
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Raymond Filion de TVA Nouvelles. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, Madame Hogan. Pour revenir au transport ferroviaire, 8 ans après la catastrophe de lac Mégantic, qu'est-ce que ça vous fait de constater aujourd'hui que Transport Canada n'a pas donné suite à toutes les recommandations de 2013?
Je suis très préoccupée par le fait que tant de temps s'est découlé depuis nos premières recommandations en 2013. Notre rapport en 2013 a été mis juste avant la tragédie de lac Mégantic. Suite à nos recommandations dans ce rapport, Transport Canada s'est engagé à mesurer si leurs activités de surveillance allaient vraiment améliorer la sécurité du rail. Et alors, nous avons constaté qu'ils ont fait beaucoup d'activités, mais qu'en effet, il y a encore beaucoup de chemin à faire pour être en mesure de démontrer que la surveillance améliore la sécurité sur les rails à travers notre pays.
Est-ce que c'est seulement une question de savoir si les efforts de Transport Canada améliorent la sécurité ou pas, ou il y a vraiment des lacunes, selon vous, au niveau encore aujourd'hui de la surveillance et la façon de faire de Transport Canada pour s'assurer que les risques sont amoindris le plus possible?
Mais c'est un peu des deux. Alors, tu ne peux pas savoir, si tu ne mesures pas si tes actions améliorent la sécurité, tu ne sais pas si tu devrais corriger ou changer les actions qui sont prises. Alors, c'est vraiment à Transport Canada d'être en mesure de démontrer que leurs actions ont vraiment un impact et que c'est pas juste une augmentation d'activité.
Merci. Operator, do we have another question on the phone?
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for taking the questions. I'd like to focus in on the aspect of the report on long-term water advisories for First Nations. I know you make it clear in your findings that adequate resources have not been provided to give way to clean water in a number of communities. Given the government's previously stated goal of trying to lift all those advisories by March, which is, of course, no longer the case, but in your assessment, was it clear from a financial perspective some time ago that the government had failed to provide those adequate resources and that it was not going to be able to meet that target for some time?
So while we were carrying out our audit, it was becoming clear to us that it was unlikely that the government was going to meet its commitment to lift all long-term drinking water advisories by March of 2021. You may recall that the department did publicly state in December that they knew that they were not going to do that. What we saw from a funding formula aspect was that it is 30 years old, that funding formula, and it is currently not meeting the needs of First Nations. This is evident partially by the lack of ability to retain water system operators. And so it is time to take a look at that formula so that any additional money that is committed it has a better chance of meeting the needs of First Nations communities and giving them access to safe drinking water.
And just as a follow-up, one of the reasons that the government has cited in terms of not being able to meet their stated March goal is the loss of the construction season and the pandemic. Again, from a financial perspective, even if there was a construction season that was able to go ahead and the pandemic did not take place, what it seems to me that it was clear a long time ago that they were never earmarking enough money in order to meet their goal. Is that a fair assessment of what your report finds?
Our report highlighted that it's difficult for them to know if they are devoting enough financial resources when the funding formula is outdated. Another important aspect that I would bring up is that there are many temporary measures that are put into place. And a temporary measure just pushes the issue a little further down the road. So it is time to find long-term sustainable solutions for the First Nations communities. While there are some plans in place or under development, those solutions won't be in place until at least 2025. That's a very long time for a community to go without safe drinking water.
Operator, do we have a third question from the phone? Seems not, so we will go to the floor. Thank you.
Hi, Chris Reynolds, Canadian Press. With regard to shipbuilding and delays in building ships, how much of the delay in the various projects would you attribute to the government, and how much would you blame the shipyards? And also, your report on the National Shipbuilding Plan was conducted before COVID-19, so I'm also wondering if you have an assessment of how the pandemic has affected delivery schedules.
So thank you very much for the question. I think that the delays that we saw in this audit should really be seen as a shared responsibility between both the government and the shipyards. So what we found is that there were delays in designing and determining the capabilities that were needed. Then there were delays in production, and the government didn't do a very good job at following up on shipyards meeting their target state. And the target state is a really important measure for whether or not the shipyards can meet the capacity to deliver ships in a sustained way instead of having that sort of boom and bust that you might normally see in the industry. And when you move out delays on deliveries, a good way to measure value for money is whether or not the shipyards have achieved that target state. And so I really think it's more of a shared responsibility, and one that we saw them taking some action together to hopefully put the strategy back on the right path.
I'm also wondering why you opted not to look at the cost of the program and its long-term sustainability and value for taxpayers. Do we have a sense of that?
So as you may know, yesterday the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on some of the costs of some of the combatant ships. And so we knew that he was going to be undertaking some work on the costing side of things. And so we decided not to duplicate efforts and that we would focus our attention on whether or not the strategy was delivering ships in a timely way in order for the government to continue to deliver services to Canadians.
Thank you. Operator, I'm going to go back to the phone.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Libertium de Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask, the government says the COVID-19 pandemic has delayed progress on some water treatment projects in First Nations communities, but you said many were already facing delays prior to it. Can you please tell us more about those delays before the pandemic and how the government should address them?
Well, a lot of the delays that we saw during our audit were linked to plans that were just very long term. So not necessarily delays, but that the solution is not an easy fix that's going to happen in the short term, and hence a longer term solution. The delays that we saw were attributed mostly to not having skilled system operators, and also linked to the fact that while there was a legislative framework that should have been set up, there was an act, there was none of the guidelines that go with that, and those are really how to operationalize the requirements of the act, and so you need those in order to have the right direction and know where to go, and so it's hard really to pinpoint the reason because of the complexities of making sure that you consider all of the uniquenesses of communities and that you consider those as you find a solution. But I think an important thing that we raised is that the interim measures are not identifying the underlying problem, and the government really does need to focus on the underlying problem in order to make this a lasting solution.
Do we have a follow-up question?
I don't have a follow-up. Thank you.
Operator will then go to a third question.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Karina Roman from CBC News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yes, hello there. Based on your audit, my first question is, based on your audit, do you have any expectation, or when can we expect that we would get all First Nations to lift their long-term drinking water advisories? Is there a year you could give us?
Unfortunately, in our audit, we didn't focus in on a year. As I mentioned previously, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution across communities in the First Nations. There are many things to consider. And the government might be in a better place to give you sort of a bigger long-term projection. What we were looking at was to see whether or not they were meeting their commitment of lifting long-term water advisories by this March. Another point I might also raise, because it's important, is that there are short-term water advisories, and just because a water advisory doesn't last 365 days doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on a community. And hence, it really is important to find out the root causes of these water quality issues so that they can be addressed. It really is an unacceptable situation in 2020 that so many people don't have access to safe drinking water.
And my follow-up question would be, you might have touched this on in French earlier in the call, but just for my sake, if you could go over it in English, how exactly do you want Indigenous Services Canada to update its funding policy and formula? Like, what should they do to do that, to have better operation and maintenance of the water infrastructure?
So during our audit, we noted that the funding formula had not been updated in 30 years. You should look at things a little more often than 30 years. I think that it's a good measure to check things on a much more regular basis. We saw that the funding formula wasn't meeting the current needs, let alone perhaps future needs that might be there. And one of the key factors that was highlighted was that system operators are currently earning about 30% less than their counterparts in other parts of the country, and hence retention is very difficult. And so you can have a water system that might work, but you also need a skilled operator to make sure that it's properly maintained and can work for the long term.
Thank you, Operator. I'm going to go back. No questions from the floor. We'll continue on the phone then.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Samantha Wright-Allen from the Hill Times. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi there. Does the audit on modernizing procurement suggest to you that the government has learned its lesson from Phoenix? And if so, what are some of the policies that suggest it wouldn't happen again?
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I was encouraged to see that the government was taking a different approach at trying to procure complex IT systems. Did I see them learning lessons from Phoenix? Yes. They do have to remain focused on making sure that sort of spreads out across all procurements. We saw through their agile processes that they were more engaged with vendors in order to do a better assessment of what their business needs might be. And we also saw them interacting a lot more with end users in the three the three acquisitions that we looked at. However, not all three had really drawn from those lessons learned. In fact, in one case, in the communications purchase, we saw that they hadn't engaged enough with the Department of National Defense, and hence their communication system that they have in place was not fully meeting their needs. And so I saw some lessons learned, but there is still the opportunity to keep continued pressure. And now they probably should develop some better training guides. If you're going to try new procurement processes that require a different set of skills, it is time to make sure that procurement officers have the tools that they need in order to make this a success going forward.
And in 2018, your office gave a recommendation for government-wide IT projects that there should be mandatory independent reviews of the project's key decisions to proceed or not. Is that happening?
So in the three procurements that we looked at, they're really early on in the beginning stages, and so it wasn't there yet. Other lessons that we hope that was learned from our Phoenix report was, as I said, better involvement with suppliers and end users. We saw that. But you're absolutely right. An independent an independent oversight committee to make sure that before you go live, that all the checks and balances were in place and that this is the right solution is absolutely needed. So I encourage the government to not forget all of those recommendations and to apply them as they move through the procurement processes in the future years.
Operator, we have a few minutes left. Are there more questions on the phone?
Yes, we do. Thank you. The next question is from La prochaine question est de Marc Godbout de Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour, Madame Hogan. Ma question porte sur stratégie navale. J'aimerais savoir, à la lumière de ce que vous avez constaté dans votre rapport, quel est le plus grand danger qui guette le Canada à ce stade-ci?
Alors, tout mode de transport a des dangers, y inclut le transport sur la rail ou par rail. Ce qui me préoccupe le plus suite à notre audit est vraiment que le gouvernement investit beaucoup de temps et d'énergie, mais n'est pas en mesure de démontrer que leurs activités de surveillance améliorent la sécurité sur les chemins de fer. C'est vraiment au gouvernement de démontrer qu'ils ont pris toutes les mesures possibles pour augmenter la sécurité sur le rail. Notre pays a vu l'impact d'un accident et c'est important que la bonne surveillance soit là.
Madame Hogan, si vous me permettez, ma question, est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? Oui.
Vous êtes un peu muette, mais je vous entends, oui.
Oui, je m'excuse, mais je vais devoir répéter ma question parce que ma question ne portait pas sur le transport ferroviaire, mais plutôt sur la stratégie nationale de construction navale. Alors, ma question est la suivante. À la lumière de ce que vous avez constaté dans votre rapport, quel est le plus grand danger ici qui guette le Canada?
Mille excuses que j'ai pas bien compris la question la première fois. Vraiment, nous avons vu des retards avec la livraison des navires et il y a peu de marge de manœuvre qui reste pour d'autres retards. Le gouvernement a pris des actions pour essayer de mettre la stratégie sur la bonne voie, mais vraiment, c'est un suivi accru parce que même avec la pandémie, il y a des retards et j'ai des préoccupations que la marge de manœuvre qui était là a été perdue avec les retards de la pandémie. Et alors, c'est important que le gouvernement gère bien les risques et les échéanciers pour s'assurer que les navires soient livrés.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from. La prochaine question est de Mélissa Fauteux de TVA Nouvelles. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Hogan. Par rapport au rapport numéro 5 sur la sécurité ferroviaire, vous dites être préoccupé par le travail qui reste à faire. Est-ce que vous êtes inquiète pour la sécurité des Canadiens?
Alors, ce que notre rapport a constaté, c'est que le gouvernement n'est pas en mesure de démontrer que leurs actions améliorent la sécurité sur les rails. Et en effet, il y a quelques mois que notre commissaire par intérim à l'environnement et au développement durable a déposé un rapport aussi sur la transportation des matières dangereuses. Et nous avons constaté de très semblables faits, que Transport Canada a pris des actions, mais il reste encore beaucoup d'actions à prendre pour assurer la sécurité des chemins de fer à travers notre pays.
Donc, je me permets dans la même veine, mettre des actions en place, c'est un, les suivre et s'assurer qu'elles sont respectées, c'est deux, est-ce qu'on est capable de dire que Transport Canada respecte et fait respecter ce qu'il met en place à l'issue de vos observations?
Alors, dans notre rapport, oui, nous avons remarqué qu'ils ont fait un meilleur suivi sur les compagnies de chemin de fer pour s'assurer qu'ils avaient adressé les lacunes identifiées durant les inspections et les audits. Mais c'est beaucoup d'activités. Et comme j'ai mentionné auparavant, quand on investit de l'argent, c'est très important de savoir que toute cette activité-là a vraiment eu un impact pour savoir si les activités étaient les bonnes mesures à prendre pour améliorer la sécurité. Et alors, c'est très important d'être capable de mesurer l'efficacité de la surveillance pour que le Transport Canada puisse contribuer à l'amélioration de la sécurité sur les chemins de fer.
I'm going to do a quick check for questions from the floor. Go ahead.
Chris Reynolds, Canadian Press. Your report mentions the 60 First Nations communities that remain under long-term drinking water advisories and how nearly half of them have been under those circumstances for more than a decade, and some much longer than that. I'm wondering if, during the course of this report, if you personally were able to see or perceive firsthand what it means to live under those circumstances, and just why that makes this issue so urgent.
So, as you mentioned, access to safe drinking water covers so many aspects of everyone's life. It's incredibly important. I personally was unable to go visit any of the First Nations because of travel restrictions with the pandemic. That is typically a step that we take in all of our audits that involve First Nations, so that we can really understand and see firsthand what they're living through. Safe drinking water is used for so many things, not only bathing your children, making your food, sanitizing your hands. And so it really is important that Indigenous Services Canada find a long-term solution to support First Nations in getting access to drinking water in a more fundamental way, right? Not just temporary solutions, but a real solution to the root cause of it all.
Finally, after this report do you have a sense as to whether the National Shipbuilding Program should be paused or even scrapped, or are we just too far down the road for that?
I think the decision that was made by the government to build versus buy is a political one, and I'm not going to go there. What we ended up looking at in our audit was whether or not they were delivering in accordance with the schedule that they had put into place. The actions that we saw taken in order to try and put the strategy back on a good target were positive. Adding a third a shipyard, working collaboratively with the two other shipyards and finding more realistic timelines for delivery. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there's very little wiggle room left for further delays. And so managing that calendar in a better way and managing the unforeseens that might come up, the contingencies, is something the government has to keep focused on.
Recognizing that we're a few minutes over time, we'll check for one last question from the phone.
Thank you. Merci. The last question is from, la dernière question est de Brittany Hobson from APTN News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hello, Brittany Hobson, APTN National News. Just wondering if at all through the audit, did you get any clear indication on why Indigenous Service Canada has not updated the 30-year-old funding policies?
So no, I think that's a question that you could probably ask Indigenous Services Canada at some point. We did not get to the root cause of why they had not updated that formula. We identified it as a weakness and hence made the recommendation that not only should they update it now, but they should make sure that they look at it on a more regular basis. 30 years is really a long time before you revisit something to make sure that it's meeting the needs of First Nations communities. So it's not just about giving them the right financial support, but it's also about supporting them to make sure that they have the solutions to even carry over to the water systems that are under the responsibility of First Nations. So it's more global of a support than just money, but the money is an important aspect.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, you had mentioned that in the report it said that a regulatory regime has not been set up, and this was suggested about 15 years ago. I guess what is your response to that nothing has been set up in the past 15 years, and essentially how would this have helped communities?
So a regulatory regime really includes two key elements. It includes an act, a legislation, and then sort of the guidelines that go with that. The act is in place. That was put in place a few years ago. It is really how you operationalize the act. So the part that really allows people to put it into action on day-to-day is what's missing. And this is just a basic legislative framework that First Nations communities should have, that other communities have all across the country, to ensure that they have the measures and the powers needed in order to have the changes to get access to safe drinking water.
Operator, it seems we do have extra time. If there are more questions on the phone, we can take a couple more.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Alexis Riopel de Le Devoir. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour, Madame Hogan. Ma question concerne le financement d'accès à l'eau potable dans les communautés des Premières Nations. En décembre dernier, le ministère des Services Autochtones Canada a annoncé une nouvelle enveloppe, le fonctionnement et de l'entretien des infrastructures. Je me demandais comment accueillir ce nouveau financement, sachant que la formule pour l'accorder n'avait pas encore été mise à jour.
Alors, en effet, dans notre audit, nous avons soulevé cette préoccupation. Le gouvernement s'est engagé à plus d'argent pour supporter l'accès à l'eau potable dans les Premières Nations. Mais ce n'est pas clair si l'argent va être suffisant Et alors, c'est très important que Service Autochtone Canada met à jour la formule de financement pour s'assurer que l'argent qui est engagé va vraiment répondre aux besoins des Premières Nations.
Parfait. Puis en suivi, dans le budget de 2019 aussi, il y avait eu des sommes importantes qui avaient été annoncées pour le fonctionnement et l'entretien des infrastructures d'eau. Est-ce que vous avez été en mesure de constater si cet argent-là s'était bel et bien rendu à destination?
Alors, on n'a pas vraiment examiné l'argent, où est-ce que l'argent s'est rendu, qui a été engagé très récemment, mais nous avons regardé si le formule répondait aux besoins des Premières Nations et nous avons constaté que non, ce n'était pas le cas. Et alors, la recommandation pour mettre à jour le mécanisme de financement.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from. La prochaine question est de Brett Forrester de APTN News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hello. On the topic of the First Nations drinking water report, the report says some communities being targeted with interim measures might not have long-term solutions in place until 2025. So was this 2021 deadline ever really achievable, or was it kind of out of reach from the start?
And so I think it's probably a little bit of a nuance. Lifting a long-term drinking water advisory can be lifted with a temporary measure. And that is done in order to give the community some access to drinking water, while the government continues to work with the First Nations towards a long-term solution, which is typically the construction of a new water treatment facility. And so the commitment was to lift all long-term drinking waters by March. One that the government has acknowledged that they will not meet. And that's why it's important to really stay focused on finding the root causes of the issues with the drinking water, so that it's not just temporary solutions, but a real long-term solution for all the communities.
Thank you. As a follow-up, you described these findings in pretty strong terms as concerning, disheartening, an unacceptable situation. How do you expect the public to react to these findings?
I believe that anyone who would open our audit report and read it, or hear about the audit report, would agree with me that in a country like Canada in 2021, it is hard to believe that there are so many individuals who don't have access to something that many of us take for granted. And hence it is time for Indigenous Services Canada to take some concrete action at finding long-term solutions for all these First Nations communities.
Operator, we'll go to a final question from the phone.
Thank you. Merci. The last question is from. La dernière question est de Murad Hemadi from The Logic. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hello. Thank you for taking the question. So my first question is about my question is about the IT procurement report. My first question is related to the 2018 Phoenix report. One of the things that your office identified at that point was sort of broadly speaking a cultural problem about of projects of essentially not wanting to provide negative feedback and or to sort of point out problems with these major projects as they were going through the process for fear of the sort of political consequences. I'm wondering whether that's something that came up at all in the production of this report and whether that's improved.
So thank you for that question about our 2018 report, linking it to the current report where we looked at three complex IT procurements, one being the next-gen pay solution, which is a replacement for Phoenix. What we found in 2018 was a few things, some of the important ones linked to your question would be considering the needs of the end users and making sure that decision makers have complete and accurate information. What we saw in the 3 projects that we looked at is that there was a much greater involvement, at least in 2 of 3, with the end users. But they are still in early stages of those procurements. And so it's important to not lose sight of that. The government does not want to prioritize timelines over making sure that the end solution actually meets the needs so that money is well spent when you complete such a procurement. I do think it's a responsibility of everyone in the public service to create a safe environment where decision makers are given honest and complete information. And we saw a great interaction with decision makers in the solutions that we looked at. And so it's a continued focus on that is really needed.
Just to follow up about that, the supplier collaboration piece of it. So you said, collaboration with suppliers needs improvement, and you laid out ways to do that. I'm wondering whether you examined at all the issue of vendor capture. So the idea that collaboration with suppliers could lead to an outcome that better that's suited more towards the sort of products that a supplier has available rather than the government's own needs.
So in the agile procurement processes that we examined here, there were many private sector vendors who were involved in the collaboration upfront to help define business needs and the technical aspects of the solution. Involving more than one supplier encourages a competitiveness and makes sure that that the solution is one that really will meet the needs of the government. This is why we made two recommendations in our report. One about a better mechanism for transparency. As you have more collaboration, it's always a good idea to have a countermeasure, which is better, better transparency in the whole procurement process. But also to make sure that you don't lose sight of the user's needs, and that's where that independent oversight body that ensures that the process is a fair and transparent one are key elements when you introduce procurement strategies that are agile.
And thank you. This concludes the press conference. Thank you for your questions. Nous mettons fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.